So, of course, we've got the NBA Finals coming up, and we're going to have a ton of time to talk about Boston and Dallas over the next 2 weeks. But I want to talk about the teams that didn't make it there, the teams that didn't get to the finals, and why they didn't. Because as good as I think both Boston and Dallas are, there's a lot of talent in the league right now, and there are a handful of teams that easily could have been in the finals right now had a couple other things gone their way. It's important to point out what they could potentially improve, whether it be in the offseason moving forward, to get themselves over that hump. And I want to begin with Minnesota because I think this is the most interesting situation by far, because they were probably the most criticized team of the conference finals because they looked so good at certain points during the Denver series. Beating the defending champs on the road, Game 7, is a difficult thing to do, and I think the expectations were really high for Minnesota, which I talked about in the video kind of covering their offseason. But the reason they lost, why they failed, wasn't Rudy Gobert. Like, a lot of people have been pointing a lot of the blame on him. Of course, the Luka shot early in the series that won Dallas, I believe that was Game 2. That obviously has a lot to do with it, but Gobert was doing what he was supposed to do. He was a good rim protector. You could talk about defensive player of the year stuff if you want to, but like, he was doing what he was supposed to do. The guys that weren't doing what they were supposed to do were Ant and Karl Anthony Towns. Like, that's why they lost the series. They lost the series because those two guys weren't good enough to beat Luka and Kyrie, especially late in the games, and neither of them really had a good shooting series at all. Ant looked tired at times. He didn't shoot well from the perimeter. Cat didn't shoot well from the perimeter for most of the first couple of games, and even though in the last game Ant put up some pretty good numbers, throughout the entirety of the series, those guys just weren't good enough. That's the reason. And in terms of correcting that, that's what makes the situation interesting, is that Minnesota could explore some options this offseason that involve Karl Anthony Towns trades. I think those things are going to be thrown out there. People are going to try to find solutions. But realistically, given his contract, given the level of value he might have around the league, I don't know how well that's actually going to work out for them. And realistically, I think they're probably just going to end up with mostly the same team next year, which is fine. It's a team that is capable of making the finals. But I think some people are going to assume there's going to be some kind of drastic change with Cat, when realistically, that's just not really an option for Minnesota in terms of actually improving the team. A lateral move, sure, but in terms of actually improving the team, it seems unlikely. The real interesting part of this, though, is Ant, because he's just 22 years old. We all assume that he's going to continue to grow and continue to improve. But with the way the roster is constructed in Minnesota, he kind of has to get to that, like, Luka level for them to really feel comfortable matching up against teams like Dallas that have, top 5 players in the entire league. Luka, arguably the best player in the world right now. And obviously that's a tough comparison for someone in Ant that's just 22, but at 22, Luka was doing some pretty crazy stuff that Ant just didn't do in this postseason run. And so that's why they didn't make it, because those guys weren't good enough, and Ant should continue to grow and should continue to improve. But it's not a guarantee that he's ever going to be on the level of someone like Luka. And given the strength of the Western Conference with all these other teams, younger teams that are going to be, coming up and trying to be these contenders over the next couple of years, that's a little bit of a concerning prospect if you are Minnesota, despite, the ceiling of what we think Anthony Edwards could be. On the other side of the conference finals, the Indiana Pacers, this one's pretty simple. Boston's really good, and Indiana's team and roster construction just wasn't good enough. They couldn't guard well enough, and even though they were shooting the ball really well in that series, and offensively they did a lot of things that gave Boston some issues, I don't think at any point they were really good enough to win the series, at least not, in any kind of easy way. Like, it would have to be some kind of crazy 7-game series, and of course, Halliburton getting hurt didn't help. Early on in the series, it looked like it was going to be competitive, and even without Halliburton, there were some good games in there for Indiana. But I think even had Halliburton been healthy, the series probably ends in 5, maybe 6 games. And so Indiana's just going to look to improve defensively this offseason. They're going to look to improve on the wing, of course, bring back Pascal Siakam. But the answer for Indiana is pretty simple. They just weren't good enough, and Boston is far and away the best team in the conference. Another team that's interesting for me is Oklahoma City, because at the time that they lost to Dallas, they were the 1 seed. They lost to the 5 seed in Dallas, despite Dallas being a 50-win team. It was seen as a bit of a disappointment that OKC didn't make the conference finals. But looking back on that now, the fact that they took Dallas to 6 games looks way more impressive, considering the fact that Minnesota was only barely able to take 1 game off of Dallas. And of course, the Clippers didn't fare well against Dallas in the first round either. So arguably, you're more impressed now with OKC than you were when they lost the series. And specific to that matchup, they didn't shoot the ball well enough. They needed more size. Dallas, especially in the front court, Lively, Gafford, the rebounding numbers weren't crazy in terms of the differential, but it felt like Dallas was always able to get a rebound when they really wanted one. And even though Luka and Kyrie weren't fantastic for large parts of that series, Dallas's role players, their other guys, were shooting the ball well, and they were just better than the OKC role players. Those guys didn't shoot the ball particularly well, and that's the reason they lost that series specifically, and I think that's definitely informative for OKC moving forward in terms of how do they make themselves a real legitimate finals team. They have to add more size in the front court. Like Chet long-term as the 5 playing 35 minutes a game in playoff series against every single matchup is just not realistic. It's just not. Like, there are matchups in which he's awesome as the 5, but against teams like Dallas, against teams like Denver, even, down the road, maybe Wembanyama, whatever the case may be, they need a bigger option there. I think they're going to explore that, whether it be Jared Allen, whether it be Clint Capella. I know that those guys aren't, the strongest guys in the world, but they're at least give you some more size and give you another option as a more traditional 5-man. It's nothing against Chet Holmgren. It's just they generally have a roster that is kind of slight in the front court. And if it's going to be Chet and wing Jalen Williams in the front court, that's going to be a mismatch problem for them. It's going to cause mismatch issues for other teams as well, but they need a little bit more variability, a little bit more flexibility, versatility in the front court when it comes to Chet and some of these other guys. And maybe they think that big Jalen Williams is going to be the option for them. Of course, they're going to have options this offseason to improve, but that needs to be an addition for them, as well as I think they could use kind of a spark plug perimeter creator. One of those, not necessarily the exact same, but one of those like Jordan Clarkson kind of guys. Like someone that, maybe the offense is struggling a little bit. SGA comes out of the game and you put someone in that can get you a quick 6 points, get you a couple of assists, can really create some things for you. And certainly I think that would be helpful for OKC. I also expect them to explore getting rid of someone like Josh Giddey in a potential, maybe not star trade, but 5th starter, someone to replace Giddey's spot in the rotation on the perimeter there. OKC's future is incredibly bright, but they can't afford to be complacent in a conference as strong as the West, and as strong as the West is going to continue to be. Again, as I mentioned with Minnesota earlier, with some of these other teams, they're going to be coming up right behind them. Back to the Eastern Conference as well, the New York Knicks, another team that I think certainly could have made the finals this year had they been fully healthy. The obvious answer for them is that they just had a million injury issues. They were up 2-0 against Indiana, even without Julius Randle. OG Anunoby was dealing with an elbow thing. Mitchell Robinson was hurt. Then obviously as the series went on, Jalen Brunson got hurt. They just ran out of guys. I mean, Alec Burks was out there running offense for them at the end of Game 7 against Indiana. That's clearly the issue for the Knicks in terms of why they didn't make it this year. In terms of improvement moving forward for them, they're going to be aggressive in trying to get, another option in the front court or a wing. Of course, they need to bring back OG Anunoby. Julius Randle is someone that's always going to be kind of on the trade market for them, considering the fact that, yeah, they could have used him in the front court, but they always are kind of looking to upgrade that spot, it feels like. But they need to find some kind of complementary option that works well alongside Brunson, whether that's Randle or otherwise. And I honestly think that if that Knicks roster was completely healthy, they would have given Boston a lot of issues. I truly, truly believe that. I don't think the gap in a playoff setting between Boston and New York was all that big. Obviously, we didn't get a chance to see that series, but fully healthy, those two rosters, I don't think the gap was that big, and I think they had an outside chance of making the finals had they been completely healthy, which obviously they were far from it, but still some improvements to be made for them for sure. Back to the Western Conference as well, as we kind of get to all these like semifinals teams, all these teams that were pretty close either the conference finals or the finals. Denver's a team that I think is going kind of completely overlooked throughout this postseason narrative. The answer for them is pretty clear. Whether it be against Minnesota or other teams, they have a severe lack of depth, especially in the front court. Nikola Jokic having to play every single minute of a crucial playoff game is just not tenable if you want him to be as good as he is. And not only do they not have, an option in the front court that can at least like tread water for them so that they're not just completely terrible in the non-Jokic minutes, they didn't have a backup 5 at all. They barely had a backup point guard in Reggie Jackson. Then DeAndre Jordan was the backup 5. Aaron Gordon realistically is the guy that ends up playing backup 5 for them, but like they just need more depth options. They went kind of this younger route, Christian Brown, Peyton Watson, these kinds of guys that Watson specifically didn't really play that much towards the tail end of the series. They went with other more veteran players. I think in the offseason, it's very clear. Back up on the wing, back up at the 5, back up at the point. Like those are the players that they need. They need a little bit more offensive creation outside of just Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic. And whether they try and do that by trading away someone like Michael Porter Jr. or otherwise, those are clearly the points of improvement for Denver. They're still very good. There's a reason they won the title last year. It was not a fluke. They certainly could have done way better in this postseason, had a couple of other things gone their way. But also, I think it's clear that given how well Dallas played against Minnesota and how much Denver struggled offensively against Minnesota, that there's definitely some improvement to be made in Denver. Then one other team to mention here, of course, is Cleveland, the other, semifinals team that we haven't mentioned at this point. Obviously, Mitchell getting hurt didn't help. I don't think the series would have been particularly close even with him healthy. And it's not really worth pointing out out possible improvements for Cleveland here, because I don't think the roster's even going to be remotely the same going into next year. They can say whatever they want to publicly. I'd be shocked if Darius Garland and Jared Allen are both on the roster next year. And quite frankly, I think there's a decent chance that neither of them are on the roster next year. I think there's going to be some significant changes, whether it be Mitchell and Mobley moving forward for the franchise, whether it be Garland and Mobley and Allen moving forward, whether it be some combination of something else, whether they get stuff from Mitchell, they get stuff for Garland, whatever the case may be. Improvement isn't even necessarily the name of the game in Cleveland. It's just change. And that's why all of these teams were unable to make the finals, and Dallas and Boston were.